Hello, everyone. We're very happy to welcome you to the launch of the Dynamic Competition Initiative. My name is Bo Hayden, and I'm the Executive Director of the Tusher Initiative at the Institute for Business Innovation at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley and co-founder of DCI. Our mission here at DCI is to develop and advance innovation-based dynamic competition theories, tools, and policy processes adjusted for the nature and pace of innovation in the 21st century. And our overall goal is to benefit society in the maintenance of an open, democratic, liberal order. Thibaut, over to you.
Yes, hi. So my name is Thibaut. I'm also a co-founder of DCI, which is an effort developed by the European University Institute, UC Berkeley, and the VU Amsterdam, where I am an associate professor of law with the Amsterdam Law and Technology Institute, and also faculty affiliate at the Codex Center at Stanford University. Joining me is Bo, that you just saw on the screen. Also next to Bo, in a very physical way, is David Tiss, another of DCI co-founders, and Nicolas Petit, that you will see in just a few minutes. There is a note here mentioning boomers, Gen X, and millennials. I'm not sure if Bo wanted just to put that as a joke, but I actually think it's quite cool that indeed we represent the entire spectrum of all the generations, which is one of our expectation actually, but we will come back to that in just a minute. For now, I just want to tell you that we are very excited and happy to welcome you. We've been working on DCI for actually more than 18 months already with colleagues from all over the world. The objective is to develop a new focus and method of engagements so that we can actually provide policymakers and the academic world and the practicing world with dynamic tools to better understand the surrounding world. We will come back to most of our initiative in later on today. But for now, I just want to tell you a little bit about DCI. What you will see is that we aim to engage with a diverse set of people with critical thinking, and hopefully to develop a new way to look at the world. For that, I do have to start by thanking our affiliated scholars, some of whom you will see today, and also the young scholars that you will see today. They have prepared some very interesting and dynamic, I suppose, videos for you to see. Some of the initial outputs are in the forms of working papers, also case studies, podcasts, all of that, which is available on our website. And I'm pleased to show you the website. As you can see here on the screen, you can already access pretty much everything we have as of today. If you go to dynamiccompetition.com, where again, you will find the contents, you will find a list of all of the events that we have already planned. There are quite a few exciting events waiting for you. And of course, you can subscribe to our newsletter. We promise you that we won't send more than one email a month. So we truly encourage you to subscribe here. Bo, back to you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Thibaut, for sharing some of this. And we're going to go through a bit of this today, a bit of a teaser for the launch, but then we're going to start to interact more and more. So today, as I said, is about focusing on presenting the vision of DCI to you. But we look forward to this open dialogue and this engagement with policymakers, industry, and academia, including the young scholars, so that we can continuously shape this vision together. We will be looking constantly for new ways and better ways to engage. So currently, please feel free to reach out to us and connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter accounts and subscribe to a newsletter, as Thibaut mentioned. So let me just go over quickly our agenda for today, and then we'll get going. So after this short introduction, we'll start with a session focusing on dynamic competition from a dynamism perspective and economic growth and innovation. This will be moderated by Thibaut Chappelle, and he'll be joined with David Tiss from UC Berkeley and BRG, and Connie Helfat from Dartmouth. After that, we'll talk about dynamic competition more from the competition perspective and competition policy, and that'll be moderated by Nicolas Petit from EUI and the College of Europe, and he'll be joined with Bill Kovacic from George Washington University, and Joanna Constantiu from Copenhagen Business School. And then last but not least, we'll talk a bit about our initiative specifically. So we'll try to bring this all together. We've talked a little bit about this in the introduction, but Nicolas Petit will talk even more about our vision, our principles, our commitments, talk about the activities and what's coming up next. So also one thing that'll be a little special about this is that our young scholars have worked on several videos that go over dynamism and competition and our initiative. So we'll be playing those for you today. And I'd like to give special thanks to Natalia Moreno Peloso for working to push this through together with all the young scholars. And also special thanks to our supporting institutions, UC Berkeley, EUI, VU Amsterdam, and the Berkeley Research Group Institute, and to Carla Soler-Riba for organizing this launch event and keeping us organized in general. So Thibaut, back to you to get us going.
Yes, thank you very much. So indeed, now is the time for the first panel. As you may have understood, we have decided to introduce 3 panels, one on dynamism, the second one on competition, and the first one on the initiative. So we cover the entire spectrum of what is DCI, Dynamic Competition Initiative. So regarding dynamism, let me just take 1 or 2 minutes to explore something which triggered my attention, and I hope this will trigger yours as well. Dynamism is one of those words like innovation, I suppose, that everyone is in favor of. I've never met any scholar telling me that dynamism was bad and that it was better to be in a static world. And yet very few of us can actually define what dynamism is. And certainly I couldn't define it properly. So I did what I suppose law professors are doing. I opened a old, dusty historical dictionary and tried to have a look at the meaning of dynamism. We indeed have a saying in France, ce que l'on conçoit bien s'énonce clairement, which in English translate as whatever we well understand, we express clearly. So I want to take here a minute to explore the meaning of dynamism. So we talk about the same thing in this panel and beyond, of course. So the word dynamism comes from the Greek dynamis. This is certainly not the right way to pronounce it, but we may get help here from a few people on the panel. In any case, dynamis means strength. Now, dynamis is derived from dynamikos, which means powerful and efficient. So in a sense, the roots of dynamism indicate a force toward efficiency. And in fact, dynamism has been used precisely in that sense when it first appeared in the writings of the German philosopher and mathematician Leibniz. Now, if we apply that to our fields, dynamism, of course, has a positive connotation, but it remains poorly defined. We indeed talk about dynamic competition, but the question, I suppose, would be, is static competition even a thing? As John Holland once said, if it's in equilibrium, it must be dead. So static competition appears to be an oxymoron, and yet we talk about dynamic competition, and maybe that is something we want to better define. Similarly, we talk about dynamic economic policy, but every policy is a disruptive factor in the ecosystem that changes the environment in which the market players will evolve. And because they evolve in a new environment, this will create new interaction and thus dynamism, at least in the short term. So one question would be whether there is a good and a bad dynamism. And recall that dynamism, as I mentioned to you, means a force toward efficiency. But should efficiency be the sole objective of policymakers in 2022? That's a question we may want to answer. And if not, how to combine efficiency with other objectives, how to address the trade-off. Well, it looks like this is all the questions that we may want to provide an answer to. And it also appears that after being a law professor for opening an old dusty dictionary, I'm even more of a law professor for asking a lot of questions and providing absolutely no answer to those questions. Luckily, I am joined by 2 fantastic scholars who I know have at least some answers to those questions. So first, let me welcome Connie Helfet, who is one of the DCI affiliated scholars and also a professor in technology and strategy at the Duck School of Business. And we also welcome David Tiss, one of DCI co-founders and also a professor in global business at the Berkeley School of Business. So welcome to you both. I will give you the floor in just a minute, or actually 2.5 minutes, because before I want to screen one of the videos that our young scholars prepared, this one being about dynamism. So Natalia, whenever you are ready.
Technological advancement is at an all-time high. Take microchip technology. Here's a graph with the number of transistors on a silicon chip over time. The line is straight, but that's because the scale is a logarithmic one. Here are the same data points on a linear scale. Growth has been exponential. The present and future are happening a lot faster than the past did. With technological advancement comes economic complexity. Markets are more complex than ever. Market players cannot make sense of all possible interactions, so complexity means uncertainty. And this uncertainty is the background against which competition takes place. Uncertainty can stem from rivalry. A firm has competitors. An athlete running a 200-meter sprint is running against the several other athletes competing in the same race. But even when none of the others come close to being a threat to our athlete, this doesn't mean she will remain unrivaled. Firms active in adjacent industries or even entirely unexpected entrants can come in and outrace the once victorious firm. TikTok, which launched in late 2016, quickly came to surpass incumbent social apps such as Facebook and Instagram. And there are more sources of uncertainty. The athlete could get injured at a crucial moment. Weather conditions could change. Fans and sponsors may fall out of love with the athlete, the modality, or even the sport. The possibility of unexpected events and external shocks keeps a firm alert in competing mode. To compete under uncertainty is to explore, to diversify, to innovate. Innovation can come in various forms. New products and services, new means of delivering these services, new business models, new ways of combining assets, new production techniques, and so on. The most valuable innovations are the game-changing ones, those that fundamentally alter the nature of the market, setting off a whirlwind of change. You may have come across DALL-E 2, or in its renamed version, Crayon, a new AI tool that took the internet by storm last month. You type in a text prompt and, in return, Crayon generates 9 different pictures that match that prompt. The generated images do not pre-exist in a database or on the wider web. They are created by the AI generator. A chord sketch of Yoda? You've got it. An old Victorian photo of an astronaut? Here you go. A jar of pickles floating in space? Strange, but voila! The quality of the result is still quite hit and miss. But with some refinement and improvement, AI image generators such as DALL-E Mini could give stock image databases, such as Getty Images or Shutterstock, a run for their money. DALL-E Mini is not a perfect substitute, but its innovation would nonetheless make it a competitive threat. And there are already new firms entering and competing on performance. Recently, reports said Google's new Imagen AI outperforms DALL-E on text-to-image AI. It's dynamic competition at work.
Again, Natalia and all the team, thank you very much for the video. I guess this will be a good icebreaker. So maybe Connie and David, I'm curious to hear your take, especially on the content, of course, of the video. So welcome, and yeah, please, let us get started. So Connie, maybe, why don't you go first?
Oh, you want me to go first? Okay, well, this is...
Well, it's always woman first, but of course, this is sometimes, not an advantage because there's time to think about what you may want to say, but please.
All right. So first of all, it's an amazing video. The students who did that did an incredible job. I'm really impressed, not just with the presentation, but actually the content. It sort of hit the nail on the head. So I wanted to pick up on something actually that was at the end of the video, where just like there was this throwaway line that said, oh, and game-changing innovations are the most important ones. And so I thought I might talk about, well, what do we mean by a game-changing innovation, right? I mean, there are a lot of ways to define this. One is an innovation that reshapes or shapes an entire market and other type of environment, right? So, and the reason I think those are so important is because they open up entirely new areas for innovation and growth, right? So it's not just that they are on their own. So I'll give you an example, which is a smartphone. I mean, all right, this was 2007 when Apple introduced this. We now are tied to our smartphone. But think of all the players. There are a ton of competitors making smartphones now. There are app designers. It goes on and on. The amount of growth that this has spurred, I would hazard to say we'd never see TikTok in that example if it weren't for the smartphone. So I think that we really do want to think about the impact that these innovations have, not just on competition, which is true, but also on all the growth that they spur. And I think that's really a critical piece of all this.
Well, yeah, thanks a lot. I never heard anyone putting it this way, actually, and I love it. Innovation that defines new environments. So if you think of it in terms of complexity science, you do have a new environment, and of course, it changes the dynamics within this environment. So I'm sure we will come back to this, but David, why don't you tell us about your feeling towards the video, and welcome.
Yes, indeed. And it was an excellent video. And to pick up on where Connie was, we often forget that the real contribution of major innovations and what I call enabling technologies or enabling innovations is that they actually open up avenues for more inventions. So there's a positive spiral of activity that takes place with innovation. And we kind of know that in the abstract. In economics, we talk about spillovers, but we very rarely give much structure to what the nature of those spillovers are. And we often forget that it's not just that it triggers other innovations, but that it opens up broad avenues for further innovation. So there's this not just a spawning effect from innovation, but there's actually the creation of new opportunities. So the positive virtuous cycle, if you will, that innovation can engender is one thing that is critical, and I'm glad it's being discussed. I think another thing the video drove home is what I call the broad spectrum nature of competition. We like to think that in marketplaces that people are confined to individual markets, or like a swimming race, people are confined to their own swim lanes. But in fact, the nature of innovation is very haphazard. The way forward is haphazard. You can't predict necessarily where the competitive outcomes and impacts are going to be. And that makes the analysis of competition, of course, a lot more complicated. But this, I think, is relevant to the whole big tech debate. You can't sort of cabin in individual companies and say, well, this is the relevant market in which they're competing. They're competing all over the place, and we need to understand that better. So I think there's a lot in that little video to spark discussion and further inquiry.
For sure, I could definitely see myself, screening the video to my student and then discuss the video for a full course. Cody, maybe you had a reaction, had that feeling.
Well, actually, I just agree. I mean,
okay,
that's all.
It's a good start. Yeah. So maybe why I want to insist on one point that you just made, David, and actually Connie, and take the analogy of a swimming race, right? So it will be, of course, it will be hard to imagine that we could have a swimming race in which, instead of having those lanes, all the swimmers could go in all different sorts of directions. And yet this is what we see out there, right, on the markets. But when we try to translate that into policy, and especially if you work for a competition agency, but not only competition law, we tend to model this kind of race with those lanes, and where the players will stay in just one lane. And so this is one of the thing, as you may know, and as you surely know, David, that we want to study here, which is how to translate all that into something that is workable for the policymakers. This is not the only objective, but certainly one of our objectives. And so let us suppose here that we live in a parallel universe in which the policy agenda, when it comes to economic growth and innovation, is truly dynamic, right? So everything that we can do as public institution is actually being put in place for dynamism. I'm curious to hear from you both, actually. What are the 3 points of such a dynamic policy agenda? So if you could just list those points and maybe detail what they entail, that would be great. So again, I don't want to, maybe Connie, if you feel like it, you can go first, but otherwise I could, drop the ball to David. So it's up to you.
Sure, I'll take a stab at this, and then
All right.
I'm sure David will chime in. So I guess I would take sort of a broader approach than just what should a competition agency do, either legal or regulatory. And I kind of go back to say, well, who's doing the innovating here, right? I mean, it tends to be either individuals or some kind of organization, right? And often firms and for-profit firms. And so you just think, what's the best way to encourage innovation? I mean, this goes back to my idea of where does growth come from? Where do the new innovations come from? They build on prior ones. And so in order to innovate, firms, one thing they use are their assets. We call them their resources, particularly their knowledge and their capabilities, which is what I study. So probably not a surprise I'm bringing this up. But I think it's really important, kind of make sure you don't, I think of it as you don't want to kill the geese that lay the golden eggs, meaning you don't want to kill the resources and capabilities in the process of trying to, figure out if there are competitive or regulatory harms. All right. So, and I'm reasonably certain that policymakers are not thinking about resources and capabilities of firms. They're much more worried about any harms that are coming and not thinking about, well, where's the innovation coming from in the first place? So I think actually policies that would actually help enable innovations and help companies build their resources and capabilities for innovation would actually be extremely helpful. Because what happens is, think about a small company, a startup. They've got an idea, they hire some engineers, all of a sudden they start building their knowledge base, their capabilities. If they do well, they're successful in the marketplace. We know there's going to be competition based on innovation. So these firms are going to build their capabilities and resources even more. They're going to innovate even more. And this is part of what David's talking about with the virtuous cycle. So in order to keep that going, you got to make sure you don't kill the companies that have the most valuable resources and capabilities. So I really think that is a really important part of competition policy, dynamic competition policy.
Well, thank you very much. So that would be one major policy implementation, I suppose, right? You will go to this one, and that will be the
that would be one. If you ask me for my biggest priority, I would put it there because I think it's not on the agenda at all.
All right, so David, I'm curious to hear about whether this point was listed in what you wanted to disclose right now on your list, or if you have other ideas.
All right, so let me sort of address some tools or theories that I think we need to develop in order to improve, and I'll focus more on competition policy. I'm with Connie, obviously, in believing that we need a theory of capabilities, or we need a theory of the innovating firm. And that theory has to pay attention to how firms innovate and how capabilities are developed, not just how we create value, but also how we capture value. So that's missing and needs to be an important element. I think it will lead to a completely different worldview around a theory of incumbency. I mean, in standard economics, we always think that big companies and incumbents have got the advantage. But of course, in the area of innovation studies, we typically see it the other way around. The new entrant has the advantage. So all the biases and all the emphasis on entry barriers and incumbency turned on its head. We think about disruption and we think about the small competing against the big and the vulnerabilities of the big. So there's nothing in our theories of competition which actually speak to the vulnerabilities of bigness. So I would like to see development there. The liability of bigness or the liability of incumbency needs to be part of our understanding of the competitive process. And that's obviously going to differ from when you're in the platform world and when you're in the non-platform world, but developing an understanding of the liabilities of incumbency, which of course is a flip side is related to the flip side of what Connie is talking about, which is how do firms develop capabilities, and it's often new firms that can do it better than old. I think we also need a theory of potential competition if we're going to do good competition policy analysis. And once again, you can't have a theory of potential competition without understanding the evolution of capabilities. So Connie's point flows right into creating a theory of potential competition. And it's absolutely pathetic that in the field of industrial economics, there's almost nothing over 70 years that has enlightened us with respect to how we should think about potential competition. And I think there's a chance to escape that trap by developing a capabilities approach. And likewise, I think that there's nothing about sort of the life cycle of organizations in traditional analysis. And we know that, capabilities get developed for one context and then the context changes and the capabilities have to change. So I think we need a greater systematic study of that. And in a dynamic world, the notion of life cycles is really quite an old one, but it's quite amazing that there's absolutely nothing in industrial economics about life cycles. But it's an easy step, I think, for some of us to jump into. And then if we're not going to be talking about markets, we need to be talking about ecosystems. And complexity theory and deep uncertainty and everything else leads us towards a systems view of the world. You can't do economic analysis in silos. And the ecosystem approach is just one reminder of the fact that we need a systems approach. So at a high level, we need to look at everything from a systems point of view, get out of the boxes that we're in, because those boxes, affect or reflect really a static analysis. So coming back, Thibaut, to your first discussion about dynamism and the dictionary definition, tying that to a force for efficiency. Of course, I'd revise that to say the dynamism is really about a force for innovation. And you can call that dynamic efficiency if you want, but I think you lose so much by keeping the word efficiency in there. And Connie and I know there's a very big literature in strategic management, how innovation and efficiency are often at war with each other. But, the Chicago approach to competition policy, emphasizing efficiency all the time, you actually end up squeezing out innovation. And so that's a fundamental problem we have. Our current theories that are efficiency focused are implicitly anti-innovation. So it's not like, we're coming from a level playing field to advance efficiency to advance innovation thinking relative to efficiency thinking. We're actually starting from way behind, where all of our models in public policy, and many of them in management too, for that matter, start from an efficiency perspective, in which case innovation's already being kicked out of the room. So we've got to bring an innovation first approach to policy making, and we've always got to favor the future. And looking at policy decisions, it should be favor the future, not the here and now. And if you look at competition policy and merger analysis with a focus on 1 and 2 year time periods where there's an impact on price, this is all crazy stuff that's really standing in the way of a proper analysis of complex business arrangements. So we've got a lot of work to do in the dynamic competition, with the dynamic competition initiative, but you're putting forward the right questions here for us to sink our teeth into.
Well, thank you very much. I want to insist indeed on that last point that you just made in the relationship between innovation and efficiencies. This is, as you both know, but for everyone out there, one of our center of attention when indeed we kind of reject or feel that there are gaps that we can fill when it comes to understanding innovation and creating a theory toward more innovation. And indeed, we reject this kind of mindset where everything will be efficiency related and therefore that's the end of the discussion. So I'm curious to hear from you, Connie, actually on that particular point and looking at your expertise, if you can develop a little bit more on this idea of tensions between innovation and efficiencies and why we may want to pursue innovation as opposed to going through, you know, the efficiency lens all the time.
Yeah, so maybe to echo what David said, the efficiency lens is totally static. I mean, you know, yeah, 1 or 2 years out, that's really not what's relevant for most major innovations. So, and I'm not sure that, you know, equilibrium economic theory is well equipped to deal with innovation in the sort of the standard efficiency sense, right? So I do think that there are ways, but we haven't done it, to try and connect things like the foundations of innovation, like the resources and capability to competition, right? I don't think it's been done, not even in the strategy field where I work, right? I mean, we have research on competition, we have research on innovation, we have research on resources and capabilities. And there are really not very many papers and research that actually puts all that together. So I think that's a huge agenda, actually. You know, how can we think about this in ways where we're defining the outcomes of innovation in ways that are not just efficiency. I do have some suggestions for sort of trying to model some of this. I think it's really hard to do this empirically, to say what would happen, you know, what would this look like in the future if we don't just use the efficiency standard, right? We don't have a counterfactual, but you could actually model this using some simulations where you say, okay, let's run this through. You know, we've got a bunch of innovators, they have certain resources and capabilities. You know, what happens if we put certain policy prescriptions in place? Is this going to help or harm innovation? So I really think that's a way to go.
So both of you actually mentioned the gap in the literature, which is certainly something we want to fill. And on that particular point, I'm curious to hear from you about the theories or the tools here, especially that you think we need to better fill the gap and address indeed the theory of innovation or the theory of potential competition, or to better understand dynamic capabilities, all the points that you mentioned. We have to start somewhere. Of course, we have already undertaken quite a few projects that are again available on our website, but there is definitely room for more. So which tools here do you think we need the most? And where should we start if we indeed want to develop such theories? So for this, I will start with David, actually. So David, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Well, at a highest level, I think what we need to do is to toss out the existing theory of the firm and put in and develop a theory of the innovating firm. Once we have a theory of the innovating firm, it's going to be capabilities oriented, and that's going to be our touchstone for everything. I think once we have that, we start to look and think more seriously about incumbency and the advantages and disadvantages of incumbency. And that will, I think, lead us towards a theory of potential competition. And once we have a theory of potential competition, you know, we do have some chance of actually understanding what Connie was talking about modeling. Or put the other way, the type of modeling that she's talking about would help us understand the new sources of competition that are likely to emerge, and whether or not, you know, a potential competitor is likely to be able to challenge an incumbent. we have no easy mechanisms for doing this right now. And this is part of the white space that I think needs to be developed if we're going to have a robust, theory of dynamic competition. The thing I would say is that it's most important to start out on this and start thinking dynamically. I mean, a lot of folks say, well, because you over there in the dynamic competition initiative haven't worked this all out, we're just going to continue business as usual, pushing our static models until you figure it out. To me, that is an intellectually dishonest approach. And you see, this is exactly what's happening. The word dynamic efficiency is now all over the place. Standard industrial economists will say exactly what they were saying before, but will put maybe a time dimension on it and use the word dynamic and talk about dynamic efficiency. And of course, it's pretty much an oxymoron. We should banish the word efficiency and maybe use efficacy or something like that, if you wish. They want to keep the word efficiency in there because it legitimizes all the standard tools of microeconomic analysis. But I think what we're trying to convey is that the standard tools of microeconomic analysis, they might be still relevant in those corners of the economy where there isn't much innovation and there isn't much global competition, but everywhere else, the other 80% of the economy, they're not relevant. And so that's the journey we've got to go down. We have a long way to go. That's why we've formed this initiative, because it has to be a collective effort. It can't be an individual effort.
Yeah, I was about to say, I'm sure you will agree with me that to reach those theories and develop those, you will need to work with lawyers and economists, but not only, right? You will need also to work with people with more of a management perspective, behavioral perspective, and the industry. So that's what we're here for. But Connie, what is your take on this question? So once again, the tools that we would need. So where would you start? What do you see in the literature? What do you think is feasible as we speak? Yeah.
So one thing that actually your comment and David's made me think about is that there's a rather large literature on organizational learning, all right? And that's completely ignored in anything I've ever seen on competition policy, right? But if you want to understand where innovations come from, other than from a sole inventor, we're talking organizations, how do they learn? Because that's how they innovate, right? And there's also big literature on how organizations manage to get groups of people to function together, right? I mean, that's another big thing. I mean, if you have a mess, you can't innovate, right? So I do actually think that there are like big missing chunks if we just think about dynamism from a standard IO perspective. You're not going to get answers that I think are helpful. So I do think this is not easy, because you have to bring together scholars from rather disparate set of communities. So I mean, that's actually one of the benefits that I see for this initiative.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not easy, but as a competition scholar, I don't want to speak in the name of all the competition scholars, but certainly for myself, I was not aware of that, right? I mean, of course I was, because we had discussions over the last few weeks and months, but otherwise, this is not something that I see from my competition angle. All I see is the case law and maybe computational scholarship. So again, I think this is one of the beauty of the DCI. So we are almost reaching the end of the panel, but I want to jump in time and imagine that we are in 2025 and we have the DCI annual meeting somewhere in between the metaverse and Italy, I suppose, or maybe UC Berkeley, who knows. I'm curious to hear from you which elements you think we should review to assess if DCI has been a success. So what are, again, the elements that you will take into consideration? What should be a good sign in 5 years from now, or at least I suppose 3 years from now, that DCI is a success in a sense that the policy agenda is becoming more dynamic and that we are moving towards the right direction? What should we look at? So Connie, why don't you start on this one?
Okay, I think before you say, what are the inputs to this success? I think bringing in a broad range of people with expertise would be very helpful. So that goes back to our last conversation. And I think that getting engagement with policymakers is obviously critical. I mean, you know, just to get people to listen and to see these different perspectives. So I kind of feel like beyond studies and research papers, I think just some ways that we've engaged, right? The policymakers are actually, we've been able to bring them to the table in some way. Of course, you'd like to have some outcomes that reflect this, but I think initially you just need engagement.
Would be a success in and of itself.
Yeah.
David.
So, Connie, yes, you've identified the process that we need to engage in to get somewhere. So let's think about 2025, and let's assume we've been very actively engaged in a multidisciplinary research endeavors along the kind you suggested. What should we have, or what would we like to have? I think what we'd like to have, first of all, is competition policy, industrial policy, and technology policy being in harmony. I mean, right now they're not. Not only is IP not in harmony with antitrust and vice versa, but competition policy, in my view, is the enemy of technology policy, as it was with the breakup of AT&T and the end of Bell Labs. There was ways to do that where we didn't have to sacrifice Western civilization's greatest research laboratory, that we did. Getting harmony between those areas of government, of policy, which means a whole of government approach. Of course, the specialists hate this because it means that their neat and tidy little views of the world are going to be upset. But if we succeed, we'll have an integrated approach. Secondly, we'll have M&A policy that actually looks relevant. There'll be a different sort of checklist or criteria for things to look at. It won't be efficiency focused. The Williamson efficiency trade-off will go out the window. It'll be a different type of trade-off around innovation, and it won't be purely Schumpeterian in the textbook sense of the word. It'll be much more complicated than that. So there'll be new M&A policy. I think there'll be a balanced understanding of platforms. They have both the vulnerability of incumbency and the advantages of incumbency, and understanding platforms and beyond network effects and scale effects. I mean, it's kind of pathetic that most of the work on platforms is still stuck on looking at standard scale and network effects, when we know that there's important issues of management, of leadership, particularly when you're starting an ecosystem. Management and dynamic capabilities matter. So there's a big management component associated with the success of platforms. It's not inexorably hardwired. Those that get ahead don't always stay ahead. They may stay ahead if they're well managed, but they don't always stay ahead. We need an understanding of that. And I think we'll also have a much better understanding down the road of what we've referred to, what Nicholas Pettit calls broad spectrum competition. In sync with thinking about relevant markets, we have to understand the generic nature of competition that's coming from complex platforms. So there's work to be done around platforms, but in fact, almost all of the focus now is on platforms, and I think it's once again an effort to silo off thinking as if platforms are the only form of innovation out there. They're not. So I think we in the end would hope to have a much more multidisciplinary approach that has led to coherence and convergence between technology policy, industrial policy, and competition policy. That would be my dream.
Beautiful. So I guess we will need to open the firm black box for real, right? But also the platform black box and the industry black box. To be fair, I did not realize when I drafted the question that we were in 2022 already. So maybe 2025 is a bit too short ahead of us, but 2030 is a better timeline. You know, we have 2 minutes left, so I suppose I will just give you a final word to conclude and maybe to tell us about the single most important point that I failed to ask you about in my questions. And I'm sure there are many of those, but if you could just please choose one, that would be great. So Connie, what is the last word?
The last thing I would say is that I agree with David 100% that, look, incumbency is not necessarily give you an advantage. And I've actually done some research on this, on what you might call dynamic competition. But I also would like us to remember that big doesn't necessarily mean bad. I mean, we could go back to Harold Denseth, who told us that you might be big and because you're good at something. And I think that applies to innovation. Well, thank you very much indeed. David.
Yeah, I think as we move forward, there should be, you know, a North Star, and surrounding that North Star, or on that North Star, I think are three big principles. One is we should always be looking for policies that favor the future. There's so much that we do is focused on the here and now and short-term things, and if we don't get our societies favoring the future, we disadvantage future generations and the very success of our own societies. I think that our policy analysis, I would label it, needs to be a innovation first approach. You know, every question we look at, we got to start with an innovation lens. Typical economics textbooks, if you're lucky, it's innovations that tack on in the last chapter. Innovation has to be the first chapter, and it has to be the opening thread. It has to be the opening chapter and the thread that runs through everything. If we're not favoring innovation, if we're not assisting the innovation process, we're losing, no matter what your social welfare criteria is. If it's anything other than short-term consumer welfare, you're losing. So a long-term consumer welfare approach, I think, requires us to favor the future, requires us to favor innovation. And then I think we have to also, alongside that, recognize that what fuels innovation at the end of the day is human capital. And if we don't have sufficient, you know, engineers and science graduates and entrepreneurs, we're not going to have an innovative society. So it's all well and good to get the policies right in the competition area, but if we're not also generating the type of people and supporting the type of human capital that's needed for the enterprise we're talking about, we're nowhere. So that's how I would sum it up.
Well, thank you so very much to both of you. I guess favoring the future should have been DCI's slogan, but maybe it's not too late for us to change that. I can't resist but to show you just a demo of DALL-E to finish with this panel that Natalia and the others were mentioning in the video. So I will ask here this AI system to generate a picture of the launch event of the Dynamic Competition Initiative. Of course, I have no idea what will come out. So let's hope for the best. And on that beautiful note, I will then give the floor to Nicola for panel number 2. But first, just give me 5 seconds. Oh, wow. So I'm not sure which picture best represents the initiative. I suppose maybe this one. This picture does not exist. It was generated by AI. And again, you know, it shows the dynamism here on the market, because if you compare the kind of service that DALL-E is providing us with versus bank images system, where you have to pay 400 euros or dollars to get a picture, you get a sense of what dynamic competition may create. So on that note, thank you so very much to both of you once again. And Nicola, the floor is yours.
So we are now ready to open a session on competition, which is the second letter in the acronym DCI. And I'm very happy to be joined in this segment by Professor Bill Kovacic from George Washington University and Professor Joanna Constantiu from the Copenhagen Business School. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we are going to show you something. And I'll turn to Natalia immediately. Natalia, you have the green button.
In the policy world, we need to measure before we take action. But measurement is hard in a complex world. So, For convenience, we must assume, model, and simplify a number of things. This applies to competition policy. The main focus is on whether there is enough rivalry between direct competitors so that consumers benefit from enough short-term price decreases and cost-cutting. Prices are lowered all the way down to long-run marginal cost, but that is also where they remain. Further price reductions driven by innovation do not happen. The idea is that firms compete for existing rents, not future ones. And if the firms in the market can satisfy demand, new entrants are unlikely. Markets are in a comfortable but unexciting equilibrium. This type of competition is what has come to be referred to as static competition. It stands in contrast with dynamic competition. Dynamic competition goes beyond price competition and relies on innovation to produce new products, services, and processes. Products, supply, and demand are not constant, but constantly in flux. Successful innovation by other firms can bring competition to the market. Market shares can be conquered by those who bring an innovative product or service to the market, and lost by those who fail to innovate. Innovation can also mean demand creation and the formation of entirely new markets. Innovation drives competition. Vice versa, competition also drives innovation. The fear of innovation by others drives firms to be on top of their own innovation game so as not to become obsolete. This innovation-driven competition is far from static. It is an ever-evolving, continually changing process. Any competitive equilibrium that is reached is necessarily temporary. New products, new actors, new strategies, and new events are bound to shake up existing competitive positions. It is not the equilibrium of neoclassical economics that characterizes competition, but disequilibrium. As Schumpeter said, dynamic competition is as much more effective than the other as a bombardment is in comparison with forcing a door. And the relevant timeline is a longer one. When competition is primarily driven by innovation rather than price, consumers might experience inconvenience, such as price hikes, in the short term. But in the longer term, they might reap the benefits of innovation and technological progress. Complexity and fundamental uncertainty mean that firms do not know at the outset which series of moves is the optimal choice. Instead, firms need to explore, respond, and continually change their behavior and strategies in reaction to outcomes they co-create. It is not necessarily the most efficient firm that wins the battle. It is the one best able to adapt to changing circumstances and innovate accordingly. A static analysis might have been appropriate for assessing competition in mature, established industries like the steel one, but in the fast-paced, global and dynamic economy, a dynamic assessment should complement the picture. Competition policy without dynamism is like Hamlet without the Danish prince.
Oh.
That's pretty good. I was about to think competition without innovation is like the Beatles without John Lennon, and we could carry on with comparisons of this kind. Now, I'd like to collect instant reactions from our two panelists here. Bill, Johanna, can you just react to what you saw and give us a little feel of what your thoughts are?
I guess to begin, I think these videos are brilliant instructional tools. They carry the state of the art of education forward a great deal, and I just applaud the creators for the inventiveness and the ability to put in a small package a lot of powerful innovation. And it makes me think right away in the process of creating a syllabus for the next semester about how to make that teaching experience far more effective. So I think these are wonderful. I can think about how to complicate the video to make it in a way still more informative. And I love the Schumpeter passage from that famous chapter from Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. He talks about the bombardment, the destruction I think in many societies, the destruction is scary. It's frightful. Suppose it is your community that's being bombarded. Your business is being destroyed. The platform that has provided income, jobs, taxation is being blown away. How do societies respond to that? In many ways, they respond to it by trying to slow it down and stop it because it is so scary. And I guess a sequel to the film that I would find interesting is the political science of how you facilitate that kind of breathtaking transition, which some people describe with martial imagery. Do you need some mechanism basically to tell the larger society, this is worth happening, and we will enable the bombardment to take place, but we will not obliterate the people who've been involved. So are there collateral social policies we need in place in order to make this take place? But it's a brilliant video. It says in 2 minutes what perhaps a lecturer would have to try to cover in 20 hours. So I like it a lot, but there's an issue in the background with the bombardment that I think is very important to thinking about what it is that makes it possible to allow the change to happen.
I think that taking back to the discussion a little bit into economics, something that I could see as a next step of this wonderful video is to consider whether it makes sense to talk about the traditional markets or whether we should talk about something different. And I will come back to that hopefully later in our discussion, because maybe if we don't see the markets as we do right now and in those two videos, like racing courses, but something that is multidimensional, think about a swimming pool that you may go deep or you may go up, right? Then something may change also in terms of how we try to measure and understand competition in this environment.
Thanks a lot, both, for these very deep comments, which are actually not prepared. You had not seen the videos before the session. I thank you for these, and they will give us food for thinking in this session and in the future. Now, I want to use the upcoming time to discuss a few maybe more pointed questions. And my first interaction will be with Bill here. So we've been hearing a lot of talking about, the past is a failure. And it's mostly about under enforcement of antitrust law. And many in the conversation points out to the weights of responsibility that the Chicago School of Economic Analysis has in the current state of affairs. And so from there, the way forward for a lot of people today is to shift the dial back to structuralism and per se rules and breakups. And so there's a very clear, recipe to advance policies these days, and it has a lot of traction. And I think we at the DCI, we tend to consider that things are not that simple, that the economy has changed. It's more global, more digital, more complex. And the ideas of the past didn't exist for no reason. I mean, these ideas came for, very good reasons from the past that we probably ignore or don't remember well. The structural conduct performance paradigm was abandoned for a lot of very valid concerns. So I want to ask you, Bill, when we study the past to know what worked and what didn't, rather than just condemning the past as a massive failure, what should we use as a metric of success?
I guess as a starting point, the multidisciplinary perspective that I would like to see brought into the conversation is a historical perspective to try to answer better the question that you offer, Nicolas. So much of the history and discussion of history is done by lawyers, and lawyers tend to discuss it as advocates. That is, in so many papers, the history is presented in the form of a brief, not in the form of a more neutral, dispassionate assessment. And I think a starting point is to ask, do we have any agreement about sectors in which innovation took the path that David and Connie have been talking about? That is, where are the success stories? And to use a term that Connie used, what policies created the enabling environment for the success? That is, do we have some common understanding or agreement about what collections or clusters of policies tended to propel innovation in directions that provided the benefits that we're looking for? In other words, how do we favor the future? What policies favor the future? And in what sectors can we say, to look at competition policy, where did competition policy make it better? Where did it make it worse? I'm almost pointing in the direction of what might be called a competition policy biography for individual sectors. Whether we take aerospace, whether we take footwear, where the United States used to be preeminent and now it's a secondary participant. What about heavy industries such as steel? In what ways did specific forms of public intervention assist or retard the evolution and development of those sectors? And I guess put it another way, have we ever given the approach that David was referring to, the innovation-based approach, have we ever given it a full test? Is there an area where by design or by inadvertence, we gave those policies a full test? So I guess what I would be looking for, that is part of what I want to measure, is what's worked in the past, what got in the way, what worked, and can we do that by looking at the evolution and path of individual sectors and ask ourselves, and the question that I'd put pointedly to competition policy authorities, give me your 3 or 4 greatest hits. That is where your program over time pushed innovation or created the enabling environment. And I'd look at again the critical observers. And by the way, I think if you ask competition officials, are you absolutely indifferent to innovation? Do you not care? I guess I would say most of them say, of course we care. But a question they would pose is, how do we do it? That is what you look at. So I guess I'd be looking from the more critical perspective is, where have we seen good results because we were attentive to these concerns? So my historical pitch would be, how have can we come to some larger agreement about what different policies over time have shaped the development of specific sectors? And what would that tell us about what to do the next time? I'm aware of all the problems of doing case studies. I'm aware that they're not representative. They're too selective. Nonetheless, to get some of these questions about how firms behave, how organizations behave, what choices have they taken, what shaped their choices over time, I'd really like to see this historical perspective brought to bear.
Well, thanks a lot, and thanks too for providing actionable items for future research. And we actually want to do case studies in the DCI, and we believe we have to start somewhere, and this is probably the right thing to do. Turning to Joanna, and a little bit along the lines of what Bill was saying with broadening interdisciplinarity towards, Bill mentioned history. I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about a pretty obvious yet under researched target for interdisciplinarity in our field, which is the business and management literature. So my question, so far we've been having a conversation between lawyers and economists mostly, and we believe there are gains to make by engaging with the business and management community. And so my question is, what can this knowledge fields bring to our conversation that we don't have now? And maybe more importantly, what should we be attentive to when we try to speak with people from your community? So what, there are probably limiting principles and dangers in trying to read through that when you're not trained in the discipline. So what would you point out?
I think this is a very interesting question, Nicolas, and I think one should consider what is the current environment that we're in. We're in an environment of digital transformation where these digital platforms have started actually from matchmaking or efficiency goals, sometimes even from innovation goals, as we see, and then they evolve to something that we call digital ecosystems. And there, in that environment, we do see that markets are melting. We do see companies from different markets collaborating and competing. Actually, some people talk about competition, right? And interacting in ways that we haven't seen before. We also see that when we talk about innovation, as we mentioned before, there is a new form of innovation building on data, algorithms, and the underlying technology of these digital platforms, that they started usually from solving a small problem, even an efficiency problem, like matchmakers, right? There was a problem somewhere, they fixed it, and then as they scaled and they increased dramatically, the technology drove them to very unexpected outcomes, as we discussed before. So what we see when it comes to value creation is that the users, or the consumers, if you wish, they are involved now, they are engaged through their data in how a particular product or service becomes more valuable. So instead of focusing a lot on the intrinsic value of a product, which would be related more to the assets and capabilities of the organization, now we also have the extrinsic value, which is something that is being created from the engagement of users, so end users, consumers, if you wish, with the product. Think about Google Maps, for example. Google Maps was just a dynamic map application. But now with the ratings that different users provide, it has become like a whole online map where you can actually, when you go to a new place, you can choose a restaurant, a bar, based on the reviews. So suddenly its value has become not only intrinsic, which will be the perfect algorithms used by Google and the data that Google had about us through our smartphones, but also very valuable because users are actually creating something on the top of it, let alone the companies. So I think we need to see a little bit this environment through management and strategy tools. For example, we have concepts like user engagement, data network effects. I can mention many, and I don't even want to start. That could take forever, right? That there are concepts and tools that they are more hands-on, coming from companies that they are trying to develop their strategy based on this new dynamics. And we should consider when we try to understand and perhaps regulate, if we need to regulate some parts of this new environment. But what I'm trying to say here is that it's a very complicated environment. And when we approach it as economists or law researchers, it's important to accept that we have to be very open-minded to new ideas. So we have to accept that maybe the concept of market, as I mentioned before, is changing. Maybe it's not the right concept to use anymore. Maybe we talk about something else. The organizations, as David Thies mentioned before, are complicated systems, right? They're not black boxes where you can easily define a strategy and say, this is about price, this is about differentiation. Innovation is also involving users in some ways. Many people talk about co-creation, competition, right? So those are issues that we need to be able to listen before understanding them and choosing whether they make sense or not to be included in a particular policy.
Thanks, Joanna. I want to really, express a token of gratitude for, placing this discussion exactly where it should be, which is that, we don't really want to think that everything we know is set and certain, and we need to be open to revisit priors and existing theories and patterns and models, and including concepts. And so I think part of the effort in also the DCI is to be open-minded and think that maybe, concepts like cooperation and competition and this sort of very binary way to think about the economy are not suit for, a world in which we are going to have the metaverse, or, 5 metaverses and a whole other economic system of complex transactions and interactions between multiple agents, virtual and real, will happen. So I want to thank you for showing us and stressing the importance of being open and not throwing either the SCP paradigm or the Nirvana fallacy as the alpha and omega of every antitrust analysis. Yes, so that's very helpful. Now I'm going to move a little bit the discussion towards the question of impact and being a player in this conversation, and I'm going to go back to Bill. So the so-called neo-Brandeisian movements, or you call them the transformationalists. It's very hard for me to say as a non-native English speaker. The transformationalists, they often paint a very rosy picture of the pre-Chicagoan past. So, the time before the Chicago School was a paradise for antitrust and a very nice world for as far as the economy is concerned. And my colleague, Professor Thibaut Scrépel, often talks about the romance of when antitrust levels of enforcement and regulatory intensity were at much higher levels. So the interesting thing, and you wrote about this in a paper, in a very good paper, Root and Branch, is that this conversation comes with very little amounts of economic evidence that application of the law correlated with growth in economic prosperity or reduction in economic inequity. And so the question I want to ask you is, how can we at the DCI advance the competition policy discussion in a world where audiences are not interested in evidence, in discussing evidence and facts, and in a world in which audiences are essentially using Twitter as the main source of scientific knowledge and information? So how can we make impact in this conversation when people have no time, people want to do stuff and like radical statements?
I mean, the gloomy view is that we're doomed, and that the broader discussion that we have in mind can't take root. I'm unwilling to surrender to that vision at the moment, and I think what I see a great value in what academic hubs can do to promote the broader conversation. And the leap of faith is that if we draw the discussion back to a more detailed examination of the phenomena that Connie and David started out with, to identify the larger context that Ioana is mentioning just now, that we will find a critical mass of people who want to engage in that discussion. And that a benefit of the case study, or again looking at a biography of individual sectors, is that we get a better understanding of how they evolved and why they evolved, where the good things came from, where policy failures came from as well. I think one reason to draw that conversation in this direction is that there is, and I love Thibaut's description of the romance of competition law. My reading of the contemporary scholarship of the history of competition law, when you go back to its origins in North America, it's a decidedly unhappy literature. It is very difficult to find a large body of commentators who are happy with what's going on. You have one body that says the competition framework as a whole is madness, and we need much greater appreciation for the direct role the government can play in guiding industries, cooperating with industries. There's another view that competition law has been too timid and not driving at the heart of economic concentration by breaking up more firms. The only people who write sanguine assessments of competition law and what it's doing are the enforcement agencies. The enforcement agencies are pretty much the only constituency that says it seems to be working pretty well. Maybe that's a very defensive assessment on their part, but the general idea that there was some awareness or understanding that the system had worked well is not reflected in the contemporary literature. Indeed, the notion that it misses the dynamic perspective that we're mentioning is a continuing lament, and about how to do that. Now, there's a big debate over whether you have to, how do you favor the future? Do you reconsider the rights granting process? Do you reconsider the IP framework? Do you reconsider the role of government in funding certain kinds of basic research and facilitating risky applications in some areas? Or to go back to David's last point, is the best thing we can do to make the decided investments that the state of California made over a century ago in building a second to none system of state universities to generate the human capital. But I think to bring the discussion back to a more example-based assessment of where have the success stories been, what policies facilitated the future, would be a useful way to do it. And I'd like to think that we could draw in a larger audience to do that. And it's an academic hub that I think has the credibility and the base of knowledge, the ability to bring in the larger perspectives that can do that. But I acknowledge that may be a vain hope, but it's why I think the enterprise, the DCI enterprise, has real value.
Okay, thanks, Bill. I reassure you, we are not ready to abandon. We're ready to put the work in, and so this will happen, and action is going to come your way too. So don't abandon. We're on the same boat, and we're still sailing. Okay, I have another question. It was my really last question for this session. We are short on time, and this is for Joanna. It's more a question about the future of the economy, and so the question is this: so we have a global economy that combines, due to digitalization, increasing returns on the supply side, economies of scale and scope, and increasing returns on the demand side to adoption. Users register increased marginal benefits with adoption of other users. This is a topic that's very dear to a colleague of ours and a supporter of the DCI, Brian Arthur. And these two properties put together, they're likely conducive to the emergence of an economy with extremely large business organizations. And so, if we think about the future of the economy as one in which the average size of the business unit has to be large, if this and this delivers efficiency for suppliers and consumers. Is this phenomenon of concentration and bigness a problem per se, which is the conversation we're having now? A few days ago, a major economist from a major consultancy firm, previously a chief economist in the US agencies, said that we have to reconsider the notion of shares and look at size in itself. So is this size problem a problem?
So I think that the size is a problem in general. I'm an economist by education, so I cannot ignore that. However, I think that by focusing only on the size, we're running a huge risk of ignoring some things that are happening inside these huge size organizations, that I wouldn't call them monopolies by no means. I would say that they create an oligopoly because they are competing against each other, right? So remember that most of them are offering exactly the same things and they're in competition. However, what we ignore is the competition that takes place inside these environments and the rules that guide this competition, which sometimes are technology driven, data-driven, right? And they change a lot what happens to everyday companies, even the incumbents that David Tiss mentioned before, because they have to be part of this environment. So we have different types of competition. We have the competition between these giants. We have competition between a giant and a big company that participates in the environment of the giant. And of course, we have competition among the companies within an environment. I will give you a very simplistic example to think as my last thought. Think about, for example, all these platforms that they actually offer food delivery services, how much they change the competition among restaurants in specific cities of the world, right? Because suddenly these restaurants are not competing as they used to do before. Now they compete based on the rules and the way that these particular platforms that they try to maximize benefit for themselves or profits, if you wish, they're actually displaying them to the potential customers. So we have this problem that it's kind of ignored because everybody is focusing on the size and the bigger size of these technology giants, which is something that we can discuss a lot. Perhaps we don't have the time now. It's a technology-driven phenomenon that has very simple explanation, but this is not the only issue. The main issue is if we could say something about the way that they set up competition within their environments and whether we can help there, because I think that's where the problem could actually be for most of us as users, consumers, or as companies.
So that's very helpful, and it ties to your previous comments about co-opetition, in which these complex linkages between users and platforms inside the ecosystem are, might be good or bad, and we need to define rules and standards to know when these logics of cooperation and competition become, more harmful than helpful. Okay, so maybe I have a last question ready. And it's a question that came up when I was listening to Bill's remark about bombardments and destruction. So, in this idea of destruction that Schumpeter wrote about, there is, in a way, maybe the idea that dynamic competition is not always a good thing for society. That it's making lots of losers. It generates lots of externalities on various constituencies and people and organization. And I'd like to just pick up your thoughts on how would we separate good from bad dynamic competition? Where would you draw the line? We can't just take for granted that every dynamic competition is a source of well-being. So and what is where would you draw the line between good versus bad dynamic competition?
I guess, Nicola, I would recognize to begin with that the upheaval that breakthroughs in different sectors create can be enormously disturbing to communities that have built their entire social framework, their fiscal framework, their employment framework around the assumption that a status quo institution or enterprise would continue. That's scary when that happens. To understand that's a consequence of the bombardment that Schumpeter spoke about. But in recognizing it, to think, how do firms react? I mean, one reaction is that you get the government to stop, to arrest the process of development. You impose regulatory controls that forbid the new idea to come ahead. You impose import controls. You take a variety of mechanisms to try to arrest the development, ultimately futilely. That's one thing. But the other thing you can do is to say, this is where public expenditure in the form of social insurance mechanisms gives you a way to tell society that ultimately the changes brought about by the dynamism are favorable. But we are not going to strand you. We're not going to leave you out on the curb and say good luck. I mean, is that where should that be the emphasis of public policy? And to facilitate transitions rather than to stop them from taking place. Because I think the impulse is that when they happen, they're frightening. and the natural inclination might be to stop it, to keep it from happening. So is that where public expenditure and public intervention can wisely be deployed?
That's very good, and that actually ties to what David was saying about the whole of government approach, which is as much, you may want to think about competition policy and its interrelations with things like industrial policy or intellectual property protection, but you may also want to think about the role of antitrust and the division of labor with other policies like redistribution and social benefits and helping the losers transition to a better situation. Johanna.
Yeah, I think that if we manage to find a way to combine the efficiency and innovation goals instead of separating them or saying that we go for one over the other, because the technology as it is today is actually working towards efficiency. But we can, of course, twist it. And with particular policies, if we understand the inner workings of the technology that underlines a platform, then we can also twist it towards innovation with the right regulation and governance rules for how the participants should interact. I think that will help us from going towards very negative perspectives when it comes to dynamic competition. But in general, I think that this is the process that we're seeing now, even in the platforms. That's why I think it's so important to understand them in order to provide some useful insights for the incumbents, that they're working in a very different way, right? So we have to bring some of these insights that we see. A platform starts as an efficiency maker, and then it becomes an innovation environment. That's the way forward. That's something positive if we manage to achieve that for most of them.
Okay, thank you very much for these very deep remarks. And so we're out of time, but if I could, I would probably invite you for a glass of wine, and the conversation we would have would be a very difficult one, which would be to decide whether we would go for a Californian wine, just like the background here suggests, or Chianti from Tuscany, from where I stand now, or maybe a wine from New Zealand, where David comes from, or maybe from France, where Thibaut and I come from. So we would have a competition for the aperitivo time to thank you and express gratitude for your remarks today. So thanks, Johanna. Thanks, Bill. You will be involved in the next weeks in the DCI. I can't wait until our next interaction. But it's time now to move on to the last segment in the launch, which consists in discussing a little bit why and how the initiative today. And so I'm turning again to Natalia, who has produced, with the help of other researchers at the UI, another source of content to kick us off.
The direction of travel is clear. Innovation should receive real, not just nominal, consideration in public policy. Especially in today's complex economy, innovation is key, with its impressive pace, nature, and volume. The benefits of innovation, it raises uncertainty, but also its possible costs to consumers, it comes from externalities, are still poorly understood. The call for a more dynamic-minded competition policy is not new. In 2015, the OECD recognized that the methodology of competition authorities should move from a focus on static competition towards dynamic competition. And long before that, in the 1940s, Joseph Schumpeter already proclaimed that it is dynamic competition that really counts. An appreciation of dynamic competition can already be found in different strands of theory. Theories that understand competition as innovation-driven, rather than price-driven, as well as evolutionary economics, complexity theory, and resource-based theory. So, for more than 70 years now, academics have preached the importance of dynamic competition. But while the academic recognition is there, translation into policymaking has remained limited. With exceptions, public policy clings to static thinking. Innovation concerns play second fiddle to price concerns. Policymakers are not to blame here. Over-reliance on static thinking mostly finds its explanation in the absence of a handbook on dynamic competition available for policymakers, agencies, and courts. That's the gap we want to fill. We introduced the Dynamic Competition Initiative, DCI, an initiative from the European University Institute, UC Berkeley, and the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, which brings together a group of prominent academics and young scholars working on dynamic competition. Our mission is to develop innovation-based dynamic competition theories, tools, and policy recommendations, adjusted for the nature and pace of innovation in the 21st century. The starting point? Taking stock of innovation-minded analytical paradigms and engaging with non-mainstream yet recent thinking from fields such as evolutionary economics, business and management studies, organizational theory, and complexity science. The ultimate ambition? Assessing whether it is operationally possible to integrate dynamism into competition and regulatory policymaking. What to expect from the DCI? We plan to bring together academia, industry, and the policy arena. We'll organize conferences, roundtables, and other events. You can expect research output from our members, and a scholarship program is in the pipeline to support a new generation of scholars from developing countries. These scholars will bring new and unique perspectives to the conversation at the intersection between policy and innovation. Enjoy the show.
Thank you, Natalia. So it falls on me to close this launch with a few remarks on what, why, and how the initiative, and I think the what was very well covered in the video. We want to bring new ideas in the current conversation on competition and economic regulation. That's really what we want to do. Now, you may ask yourselves why we are doing this, and I think the sentiment that was shared today on the various panels is that there is some concern that the discussions we're having are not rich enough in facts and knowledge, and we need to study more, even though the public conversation doesn't really want to wait. But there's also another reason why, and I'm going to give you a little bit of the, I think Americans say the inside baseball of the DCI. And so the inside baseball is this. So the DCI is really a meeting of the minds between people who didn't really know each other. And so it started this way. So 4 years ago, I find myself in Stanford with Bo Hayden, and Bo Hayden and myself, we quickly start to talk, and we quickly come up to the realization that we define ourselves as radical centrists. So what defines us is we don't like to take anything for granted, and we practice contrarianism as a hobby. Not as an ideology. We do not really pledge any oath to set ideas and propositions and theories, and we are ready to revisit. So when we were here in California, we were left sort of voiceless by what we were seeing with our eyes and hearing with our ears. So we had this felt empirical sentiments of witnessing a lot of dynamism in the Bay Area. And at the same time, there was this widespread rumor and increasing noise about market monopolization by lazy technology firms. And this disconnect left us in complete disarray. At the same time, we were seeing public policy issues of major importance arising, like concerns about privacy, security, and democracy. And we are also hearing about new competition and regulation issues that were not given much attention, such as the ambiguous welfare effects of new business models in the data-driven economy, where attention has to be sought at all possible cost. So we started to read and we started to talk to people. And we discovered the early works of Brian Arthur when he was at Stanford, working on increasing returns, technology, and later on complexity. We learned about Brian's lifelong endeavor to improve the knowledge base of mainstream economics and introduce difficult concepts like disequilibrium in the analysis. We learned about Ken Arrow and his late thoughts on the necessity to revisit the theory of oligopoly in a world of knowledge, in a world based on the communication and sharing of knowledge and the information economy. We developed a stronger understanding of innovation theory, of the importance of manager, and of the role of deep uncertainty in driving firms' strategies and behavior. And at some point when I was at Stanford, I flew to DC. I met David Teese we were discussing on a panel related to intellectual property, and David sounded interested by what I was doing at Stanford, talking with Bo. And writing a book, and I sent David a book when I came back to Europe. David is one of the first thinkers quoted in my book. His work on corporate diversification was very influential and is very influential on my work. And he wrote back with a one-line email, which I quote here, which was, "I'm very delighted by what you wrote, Nicholas." And you wrote Nicholas the right way. So I was pretty sure that he knew what I had produced and who I was. He offered to have a call, and then we started to have these monthly calls and to discuss about ideas. In the meantime, I was speaking with Thibault. I was back in Europe, and Thibault was very concerned about the ongoing discussion in the antitrust conversation, talking about large technology firms as compared to Standard Oil and US Steel and Alcoa. Thibault became very concerned with the field that prospers on anecdotes and journalism, and not so much on trying to understand the bottom of technology, science, and engineering. So as I was moving to the EUI from my previous university institution, two things became very clear in my mind. The first one is that a substantial improvement in knowledge would not arise without leveraging new resources. And so now you want to ask yourself one very obvious question. Who are the best people placed to operate behind the veil of ignorance? And the answer is simple, young scholars. The second thing that came clear to my mind was that if you want to produce new knowledge, we cannot just approach issues like journalists or as public intellectuals who want to write what I call airport books with bombastic prose that leverage anecdotes and pick facts that suits advocacy. So of course we need facts, we need observations, we need the press. But it's just the first step of the scientific method. We need to invest into building hypotheses, developing testable propositions, setting up experiments, and formulating theory from the process. And so to do that, you need also to surround yourself with esteemed experts trained in the scientific method. And so talking with David, Bo, and Thibault, it became clear that we needed to create a knowledge production platform, and this is the DCI, a matchmaking initiative designed to associate young and more senior scholars in the benefits of trying to find the truth about the modern economy. Okay. Now, there are a few assumptions that we make in the DCI, and you can go read about our principles, visions, and commitments on our website. We place a lot of emphasis on the role of innovation. The role of innovation, we think, should not be treated as innovation should not be treated as a cult. Innovation can be bad sometimes. We discussed the problems of destruction. But we don't want to treat innovation as just a slogan or a footnote in antitrust and regulatory interventions, as it often is. We also believe deep down in interdisciplinarity with historians, business and management scientists, and so on and so forth. And we also absolutely believe in the interest of crossing the Atlantic, crossing geographies, crossing generations, and crossing knowledge fields. Okay, now one last word about how we are going to do this. So we are going to use our website as the mothership of all operations. You saw it. We are going to develop new sections, new products, new outputs. We are going to have a Hall of Fame of dynamic competition scholars. We're going to have a wiki section on important concepts. We will not pull this out of thin air. So we will use as inputs a bunch of activities that we are going to organize. Roundtables, there's going to be 3 in the fall. You can go watch, one with Steve Cernak, another one with Doug Melamed, and another one with Pete Klein. If you have ideas, please reach out to us. We're going to have the first academic conference of the DCI probably in the spring here in Florence. And because we want impact, we are going to use socials and Twitter and LinkedIn in particular. You're welcome to subscribe to our feeds, where you're welcome to comment, you're welcome to criticize. Please engage. Right. So I'm going to close now with a word of appreciation for all our colleagues who helped with the launch. I won't say more about David, Thibault, and Bo. I don't want to say more about other phenomenal scholars who have been here in the past in our more confidential, initiatives and discussions and brainstorming events. They will recognize themselves. So, but I want really to address a special word of gratitude to the researchers, essentially from the UI so far, who invested a ton of time in producing these videos that you saw and helping with the launch and the website. The names are Sarah Guidi, Anouk van der Veer, Lola Montero, and Linus Hoffman. So they have been the major force, the source of dynamism, power, and efficiency behind all this today. I also want to address a particularly huge thank you to Natalia Moreno, who actually piloted the production of the videos and most of the content that you see. This has been extremely helpful and impressive, I have to say. And to Carla, who has kept us on track through the process. She's the setter of the pace for all this. She keeps us in line, and if we deliver tonight, it's mostly thanks to Carla. Right, so I think I've said everything I wanted to say. So stay tuned and help us find the truth on competition, monopoly, and innovation in our ever-changing economy. Thank you very much.